This is Greg Dooley inside Schembeckler Hall at the Towsley Family Museum, and this is the M. Victor's History Show. So we had Seth Fisher from MGO Blog on to talk about the snub of Germany Schultz from the College Football 150 Greatest Players of All Time list. So now we take another name, probably a more popular, familiar name with Michigan fans. I'm talking about Willie Heston, fielding H. Yost, great back from 1901 to 1904. And who else, who better to talk about Willie Heston than, of course, my friend, historian, NFL beat writer, and author of Stagg versus Yost and Natural Enemies. Of course, I'm talking about John Kryk. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Kryk.
I don't know if anyone knows as much about Willie Heston as this guy. So, Kryk, talk about how you felt when you saw Heston wasn't on the list, and really for Michigan fans who may not know Willie's accomplishments, why he belongs.
Well, thank you for that intro. Willie Heston not only should be within the 150, you could make a very strong argument, and I'm about to, that he should be on top of the list. All right? Here are some of these are his top accomplishments, if you want to just bare bones, if you'd never heard about this guy. And, I'm a journalist, so we are always trained never to bury our lead. So here's the lead with Willie Heston. Undefeated in 4 years of playing. And it wasn't like they played 5 games a year. When he was there in the point-a-minute years, in the first few years of the 20th century, they played full schedules like today. He was the Wolverine teams that he was on went 43-0-1. He did not lose a game in 4 years of playing at the high end of college football. Those teams, after the fact, when it wasn't just Eastern bias experts picking them, which was the contemporaneous way it was done at the time, when experts look back, they awarded Michigan at least a co-national championship in each of those 4 years. So, undefeated, 4 national championships, 4 conference championships. He was the first player outside of the East to be named an All-American twice. That was a huge accomplishment because that was in 1904, his second one, when you consider that 6 years earlier, there was never any player from outside the East ever named an All-American. So for him to dent it, not just once but twice, tells you how great they viewed him when they came to see him. Walter Camp first saw him play, who was like the father of football, and his All-American list was definitive. He first saw him play in 1903, season-ending game in a blizzard at Chicago, and he still called him great. So let's continue down the list now. He scored 72 touchdowns officially according to the NCAA. My research is either 70 or 71 because there's just a couple of games where there's disputed who scored the touchdown, so I don't think we'll ever know definitively. That said, no player before the 1980s ever scored that many touchdowns after Heston in his career from 1901 to 04. Down the list, because there are no play-by-play sheets anymore or accounts of these games, of all the games, there are certainly for all the big games. The newspapers would have a game story, they'd have columns and opinion, but they would also run basically the play-by-play, each handoff, and because there are no passes when Heston played. And so we only have accounts of maybe half of his games that are in depth, not even. So given that, he had, by my accounting of going through those, he had at least 13 runs of 65 yards or longer. I don't know if anyone's ever come close to matching that for any other player or logging it, but I can't imagine anyone else could match that because the number, if it was his whole career, because he had some of his longest runs in these games against like terrible teams. For instance, against the University of Kalamazoo or whatever, the Kalamazoo school that he played one year, he had, according to the Michigan Daily, something like 500 yards of offense in that game, which of course would shatter every record of any level of football. Continuing down the list, and last but not least, it just so happens that when he was there at Michigan, the Olympic sprint champion, the double Olympic sprint champion, Archie Hahn, was also enrolled at Michigan. And Michigan's assistant football coach, de facto, and track and field head coach, Keen Fitzpatrick, was trying to get Archie Hahn's start to become better because he was just amazing once he built up his speed. Of course, to win Olympic double, he better be. But Keen Fitzpatrick didn't like his start, and so he had match races, at least 200 on the campus during their years, Hans and Heston's at Michigan, where they just went off against each other. And Heston was so fast, he was always ahead at least 30 yards and often at 40 yards. Now, can you imagine having a running back today at Michigan or anywhere in NCAA, and that guy say, yeah, I'm ahead of Usain Bolt after 30, 40 yards every time he and I have a match race.
Well, and I think,
and of course, now that there's a 40-yard dash that we all looked at as a sort of a speed barometer, can you imagine what he might have timed back then? Willie Heston had all these abilities, plus he was Yost and others who wrote about him and commented on him. For years later, people called him the greatest running back they'd ever seen. And in fact, when they had the first 50 years of college football, Heston was on that team, not after the first 150. So as you say, before 1940, it's almost inconceivable that Heston couldn't be on this list if he made the official AP first 50 years of college football All-American team.
and people might say, well, different era and different rules before the forward pass, but I'd argue that's more reason that Heston's accomplishments are so notable. Everyone, all 11 guys were trying to stop him, and he's putting up.
Yep.
There was no waggle to the tight end that Yost could mix in, in 1904. It was all a running game, and effectively you needed to stop the other team, and they could not stop this man.
Right, and to the degree, as you well know, and that Michigan at Minnesota, the only non-win of Heston's 4 years at Michigan, the 6-6 tie, that the crowd, at the urging of former Yale All-American Puff Heffelfinger, was shouting, "Kill Heston, kill Heston," because that's how much they knew that they had to stop Michigan. You had to stop Heston. And yet, when it was 0-0 late in the game, Heston, on almost every carry, took the team right down the field, and eventually they scored a touchdown. And he was so beaten up by the end of that game, and at least one, if not two other games, he ended the game with his face cut to shreds from opposing punches, scratches. The way that it was described when Michigan returned from that game at Minnesota at the Ann Arbor train depot, same one that still exists today, students were gathered, and when they looked at some of the players, especially the face of Heston, they were shocked and outraged. And that's what built up this resentment towards University of Minnesota that wasn't present at the time when people listened to the game by telegraphic reports at various locales in Ann Arbor. But
Right.
when the team got back and they looked at his face, I mean, he got the hell beat out of him in a lot of these games. He only played in 37 of those 44 games because he was hurt. He had a knee injury, which sounds as best described with swollen knee, that he probably had a sprained MCL, if not worse, that he played on in one of those years. And so when you look at all they did, and he went both ways, of course, as they did before the 40s and then again in the 50s.
Yep.
He played both ways, and he was such a good tackler that Yost raved about it. And then one time early in the 1904 season as a senior, some wisecracking reporter asked him, well, why Heston, he's not doing much on defense. And Yost was very quick. He goes, we haven't had a runner go through the defense to get to Heston for him to have to make the tackle again.
It's fantastic. And you mentioned the injuries and stuff, but I'll just as a side note, for people who don't know this era, young men were dying on the football field, high school, college, and this just a couple of years after Heston's era is really when Teddy Roosevelt stepped in and they really made some reforms to curb that. But this was serious stuff, and again, 4 years putting up the numbers that you described is amazing. But I have to pose my little scenario to you that if ESPN came back and begged our forgiveness, Kryk, and we got a little group together and they said, okay, but we can't give you any more than the 4 that we gave you, which was Charles, Woodson, Harmon, of course, Desmond, and AC. Who are Kryk's? Who are you pushing for the 4, or who comes to mind first of those 4?
Best player I've ever seen, and I've been a fan since the mid-'70s, is Anthony Carter. Over Woodson, over Desmond.
Wow, he was number 136
he changed
on
games.
the list.
Yep. No, he was. And that's not to take anything away from either of those guys, especially Woodson, because Woodson had probably the single, if not the single greatest, most impactful game in all realms compared to Harmon in 40 at Ohio State, then Woodson in 97 against Ohio State. He had the biggest play on offense, the slant pass that he took down to whatever, the 1 yard line or the 5 yard line, and then he had the big interception on defense, and of course he had the special teams return. All in arguably what people were calling the biggest game in Michigan history at that time. And for him to put out like that, amazing, right? And we all know what those guys did. Anyone listening is certainly conversant and probably familiar with what they did, even if they're too young to have seen it live. But sure. Anthony Carter weighed 100, was listed, I think, at 165 originally, was down to, I think, 155 by he was a senior, a little more honest, but I'm told that was even wrong, that he was even lighter than that. I've never seen anyone at Michigan, and probably anywhere else, run as fast on a curl. Like, in other words, if you're doing a slant across the middle, you catch the pass like he did at Illinois in 82, and then turn on the jets and curl around to go up the right sideline or up the left sideline. He had a gear of speed that was just incredible, and he got the heck beat out of him at that small weight, and was just breathtaking athlete. When the ball would go in the air, granted they didn't pass nearly as much, of course, then under Bo, but he opened them up to make it possible for players like Jim Harbaugh in the mid to late 80s to really be able to excel through the air. And it was Anthony Carter that helped change Michigan football that way under Bo. But he was so electric an athlete, I think that he retired averaging 17 yards a touch, either as a receiver, punt returner, or kickoff returner. He led the NCAA 1 year in kickoff returns. This guy was just absolutely electric every time he touched the football, and they went out of their way to get the ball into his hands. He was amazing. So I would say Anthony Carter has to be on that list. And then it's, I guess, flip a coin between, Harmon does, and then it'd be flip a coin between who you want, Dez or Woodson.
And I know you're busy. We still got some NFL football going on. I appreciate this so much, and thanks for joining the M Victors History Show.
Hey, I'm always happy to join you. And can I just add a little tiny postscript?
Yes.
You've got Heston, who not only played at Michigan, he earned his law degree, rose up to become a Detroit Recorder's Court judge, and every player who was made the varsity. In other words, back then, of course, 11 players went both ways. Typically, they would only name, and these guys would be the only ones that would appear in the team photo. They were named to the varsity. That means they weren't with the scrubs. They were the guys that either started or played a lot. Of the 14 Michigan players in 1901 on the varsity, all of them graduated. All of them but one at Michigan. One other guy transferred to the Michigan School of Mines and graduated from there. So you talk about the team with the perfect Michigan team that everyone needs to aspire to. You've got Willie Heston, the best player, in my opinion, on it. It went undefeated, unscored upon, 550 points to 0, and every player graduated.
Kryk, you're the best. That's awesome. And, hey, I'll talk to you soon.
Love what you're doing there, Greg. Keep it going.